Very good evening, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Dr. Faruq, Professor Chandra, Muzaffar, Professor Shad, Professor Sivin, Professor Ihsan Ali, fellow colleagues and distinguished guests, on behalf of IRF, it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this conference, regional conference on freedom of religion in the 21st century Muslim societies. It's in IRF mission and vision to promote freedom of religion and freedom of expression, as well as the promotion of liberty and democratic rights has been a signature theme for many of the up-to-date events that IRF has organized. In this 3-day conference, academicians, intellectuals, political and social activists, teachers and students have come all together to discuss and deliberate on these pressing issues. Given the political, global and geostrategic constellation, I can't think of another more important or more relevant topic. Religion continues to be a very important part of our societies, not only in the Muslim world, but beyond the Muslim world. The factor or the role of religion in our lives has been actually increasing in the past few years, which is not in tune or in line with the predictions given in the early 20th century that the role of religion will decrease. So be it due to disillusionment of people with communist ideals or with the diminishing welfare state, or be it with the disillusionment of capitalist experiences or corporate world that we are experiencing today, the dehumanizing trends which are actually causing a lot of social inequality, increasing gap in terms of social status and so on, or be it purely due to natural human tendency for seeking a higher meaning in life. Religion still is a very important part of our societies. Again, not only in Muslim world, but also beyond it. All things equal, even if we take out religion after the equation, the world as it is today, it's far from being problem-free. There is still a lot of problems that we are actually facing. When we talk about the Muslim world, we need to have in mind that we are talking about close to 2 billion people coming from dozens of countries with very diverse background, with diverse historic trajectory in terms of going back to 1,400 years in time, coming from different cultural backgrounds, different religious experiences, and encompassing people that are actually having experiences which sometimes it's even contradictory. So this kind of awareness will actually help us to identify that any attempt to explain this kind of issues that we are facing in the Muslim world, be it social inequality, be it the democratic deficits, it's basically far from being attributed to one and a single factor, like what media nowadays is very fond of doing, attributing every single problem back to Islam, or back to one monolithic Islam. So drawing such kind of simplistic lines is basically due to be part of the problem rather than part of any kind of solutions that we are supposed to debate. Recent rise in fundamentalism and extremism in the Muslim world threatens religious freedoms. These are God-given individual freedoms: freedom of expression, freedom of choice, freedom to have a say on our own lifestyles, freedom to have a say on our own ideals of consciousness. These are God-given freedoms in Islam. There is no question about it. However, as much as extremists are threatening these civil rights and these individual rights, so have for long been doing the unelected, undemocratic, and unrepresentative regimes in the Muslim world. More often than not, in the Muslim world for the past 100 years. We stand against group, individual, and individual terrorism, threatening rights of individuals and rights of minorities, as much as we stand against state terrorism, threatening the rights of individuals, the rights of minorities, as well as the rights of majorities. These are undoubtedly very complex and vital issues bound to differences of opinion and debates which are likely to unfold in the next few days. Without any further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Faruq for his opening speech for this program. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. First of all, I would like to welcome you again to this conference for the latecomers especially. And I hope you had enjoyable dinner, Italian dinner just now. The most important thing that I wanted to tell you is that I'll be brief, and I'm just going to say that to share my experience with you. When I was summoned by Jakim not long ago, they sent me a letter, okay? And we had here a guy who was just summoned by the Mufti of Wilayah. But from my experience was that when they sent me a letter, it was clearly written there that they wanted to discuss on 3 specific issues. The first would be freedom of religion. Second is on human rights. And third on pluralism. The pluralism, the thing is that the discussion was about 2.5 hours, and I told them beforehand that I had another meeting in the afternoon. Otherwise, it could have been one whole day or something like that. So it was 2.5 hours. But 80% of the time, it was on freedom of religion. So you have to understand that this topic is so important, and to the conservative Muslims in this country, and especially to those who are in power, this is something that to them that threatens their what do you call their power, their
litmus test.
litmus test about them, right? So of course these are not some labais or hajis with skull caps or something like that. I went there, without knowing who would be there, who would be the panelists. So I didn't prepare. We didn't prepare at all. I didn't read or revise or anything like that. So I just went there and maybe I was expecting that these are some ustads and some labais that what could they argue with me? I mean, I'm not saying that I'm not saying that I don't think that intellectually it will be an intellectual challenge to me. You get what I'm trying to say? It's something like that. But when I went there, these are all professors. There were about 22 of them who are professors from all the different universities in this country. UIA, and some of you were from UIA, IAS, UKM, and a few other institutions as well. The issue was that they have a pile of my writings in front of them, and they were reading one by one and asking me to explain to them what I meant by those paragraphs in my writings. But of course, at the end of the day, I was actually trying to say that the most important concept in freedom of religion is this verse, and all of you have heard this verse, Surah Al-Baqarah 256, right? So the thing is that many people, when we talk about this verse, La ikraha fid din, they say that, you do not understand the meaning of La ikraha fid din, because La ikraha fid din means that, you can't force people to embrace Islam. But once you are Muslim, you cannot leave Islam. It's like a one-way valve, like something like that. You can go in, you cannot go out. Or I would say that it's Hotel California, right? You can check in, but you cannot check out, right? So I told them, like, okay, let's just look at this view, at least this verse in its entirety, right? La ikraha fid din qad tabayyana ar-rushdu min al-ghayy faman yakfur bit-taghuti wa yu'min billah faqad istamsaka bil urwati al-wusqa la infisama laha wallahu sami'un alim. Right? It's clearly mentioned la ikraha fid din qad tabayyana ar-rushdu min al-ghayy, and it's clear which is right and which is wrong. Faman yakfur bit-taghuti wa yu'min billah, and for those who rejected false deities and holds fast to the rope of Allah, and he has basically he has managed to hold to the to the rope that will not break, right? Rope that will not break. So meaning to say that the freedom is there. You can say the freedom is there whether those who want to believe in God or those who want to believe in false deities, in Tawhid. So it's clear, right? And meaning to say that the essence of the verse is to give the ultimate authority to men to believe or to disbelieve, or to believe in other deities. That's the most important factor that we have to understand about this. So of course after that, of course they wanted to discuss about apostasy and this and that, and my stand on apostasy. If I was saying that, what about there's the Caliph Abu Bakr who waged war against the infidels, not infidels, the apostates, right, during his time, isn't it? So meaning to say that if I were to say that there are no verses in the Quran at all that say that you must kill an apostate, why did Abu Bakr wage war and kill the apostates during his time? So what I answered was that according to Sheikh Rashid Ghanouchi, the leader of An-Nahda, he clearly mentioned that this particular action of Abu Bakr at that time was basically based on as-siyasatu syar'iyyah, was a political decision, based on his political decision. It's not based on any verses in the Quran or any hadith of the Prophet. It was his political decision because he considers those who leave Islam at that time, they were basically what we call as it was basically an act of treason and sedition against the government, against the Islamic government at that time. And treason, as we know, until this day is punished by death. So it wasn't wrong for him to make that kind of political decision at the time, even though there was no verse at that time, because it was based on as-siyasatu syar'iyyah. So this is a very complex issue. I don't want to go ahead. I don't want to go further and discuss about this particular issue. I think we have an expert with us over here, Professor Chandra Muzaffar, and I would like to end over there. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace be with you. In my presentation this evening, I would like to focus upon the following sub-themes. Number one, why the Marrakesh Declaration of 2016 sought inspiration from the Charter of Medina of 622, and why both the Marrakesh Declaration and the Charter of Medina are relevant to contemporary citizenship. Number 2, how the Quran embodies universal, inclusive principles of rights and responsibilities pertaining to contemporary citizenship. 3, the expression of the inclusive spirit of the Quran and the Charter of Medina in actual Muslim societies right through the ages. In that context, I shall reflect briefly on the openness of the Malay Muslim world and its treatment of the other. Number 5, I shall look at the impact of colonialism upon the Malay world, the emergence of divided societies, and how it has shaped citizenship in today's Malaysia. Number 6, why in spite of this dichotomy, Malaysia is held together, and the strains that confront us today in ethnic relations. Number 7, and the final sub-theme, how the inclusive universal values of the Quran and the principles of mutuality and reciprocity in the Charter of Medina can help to overcome current challenges, and how the moral concerns embodied in the other religious philosophies can help to reinforce common citizenship. These are the 7 sub-themes. I shall begin with Marrakesh and the Charter of Medina. It is not surprising that the Marrakesh Declaration, concerned as it is about the rights of religious minorities in Muslim majority communities, should have drawn inspiration from the Charter of Medina. For the Charter of Medina, which is the charter that the Prophet, may peace be upon him, presented to the people of Medina. It is not a constitution, but a charter that the Prophet presented to the people of Medina. It is a charter which is unique, extraordinary. It is unique and extraordinary because given that period in history, there is this charter which grants freedom of religion to Muslims and Jews. These were the 2 major communities at that time in Medina. Muslims and Jews. Freedom of religion to them. It bestows both communities and other communities with rights and responsibilities. It establishes the principle of mutual cooperation, help, assistance. It clearly enunciates the defense of the oppressed in the Charter of Medina. And at the same time, while accepting differences and diversity, the Charter of Medina also enunciates the notion of a single nationality, meaning by which Medina and the people of Medina as that single nationality, a common constitutional unity. This is what is so remarkable, that in the early part of the 7th century, you had a document which is so contemporary, that preceded perhaps every other known document at that time, in terms of its notion of justice, of fairness, of oneness, of recognizing the rights of everyone. Now, I would like to argue that that charter of Medina actually embodies the letter and spirit of the Quran. The letter and spirit of the Quran, though as you know it is a separate document, but it embodies the letter and spirit of the Quran and is relevant to our discussion about citizenship and about freedom of religion in two critical ways. Number one, the Quran establishes the right of a person to profess and practice his faith, what Brother Faruq alluded to. The right of a person to profess and practice his faith, chapter 109, verses 2 to 6. But more important, not just to practice and profess, but to do it without coercion. Chapter 2, verse 256. There is no compulsion in faith. The Quran says that very clearly. There's no compulsion in faith. So one would be legitimate to ask this question. It would be a fair question to ask. If there is no compulsion in faith, why is it that for centuries, Muslim societies and some of the great ulama had looked upon any attempt to leave the faith, any attempt to renounce the faith, as a terrible act? This has been the view for a long, long while, right through the ages, up to the present. This requires reflection. Why? If there is no compulsion in faith. It is very interesting that the Quran, if you really reflect upon this question, it reconciles what appear to be two contradictory dimensions. But only if one doesn't understand or doesn't attempt to understand the inner meaning of the Quran. No prohibition in faith, yes, but at the same time, the Quran doesn't encourage a Muslim to leave Islam. And that's true of all religions. Before Islam, before the revelation, and even after. You don't encourage someone to leave your faith. But in the case of the Quran, this discouragement, as far as leaving the faith is concerned, is related to something far more fundamental. Why does it discourage a Muslim from leaving the faith? Because being a Muslim, becoming a Muslim in Islam, is not just embracing a religion in that sense. The act of being a Muslim, becoming a Muslim, is an affirmation of your status as a human being. It is an affirmation of your Khalifahood, of the fact that you are Khalifa. You are accepting that, as Adam did. You're accepting that this is the whole purpose of your life. This is the whole meaning of your existence on earth. You're accepting that by being a Muslim or becoming a Muslim. You're accepting that. So the question that arises is, if you're accepting that, and if that is what being a Muslim means, then how can one leave Islam? You're giving up, you're yielding, you're surrendering your Khalifahood, the essence of your being, the reason for you being here. So this is the reason why, at the most profound level why Islam doesn't encourage one to leave the faith. Which means that if someone wants to leave the faith, Muslims would try to persuade the person not to leave the faith. But if, in spite of everything, a person wants to leave the faith, is insistent on leaving the faith, in spite of every attempt to explain what being a Muslim is, then the Quran itself hints that you cannot force the person to remain in the faith, because compulsion is prohibited. But equally important, friends, because there is a verse in the Quran, there is a verse in the Quran that states so clearly that there were people in the Prophet's time, and there would be people for all times who would believe and who would disbelieve, who would believe and disbelieve. It doesn't say that those who believe and then disbelieve, they would lose their lives. It doesn't even talk about punishment for them. But it does say that it is something which would annoy the Creator. It would anger the Creator. If you leave, you disbelieve, you come back, you get out, it angers the Creator, annoys the Creator. But there is no punishment for that as such at the temporal level. Certainly, he doesn't say the person will be put to death, because if that is the case, then how is that a person believes, disbelieves, and then believes, so he is still alive, right? To be able to do that. So it doesn't talk about killing the person as such, nor does it talk about any form of punishment, but it is between you and Allah, you and God. God would be very annoyed that you are indulging in this sort of practice, believing, disbelieving, and you would be judged in the hereafter. But as far as this world is concerned, the Quran doesn't prescribe any form of punishment. That is a noble position adopted by the Quran. The verse that I'm referring to is in chapter 4, 137. So on the one hand, you know, the importance of faith and commitment to faith is clear in the Quran. But on the other hand, it also knows that it is, in a sense, the ultimate act of conscience. Believing is the ultimate act of conscience. And you cannot force a person to believe, or, for that matter, to disbelieve. It is an ultimate act of conscience. And this is where the Quran protects one's conscience. I have tried to explain a little bit about this issue in the foreword that I wrote to a very old book by one of the greatest jurists in Pakistan, S.A. Rahman, the late S.A. Rahman. It's called The Punishment of Apostasy in Islam. This book was reprinted in Malaysia after many, many decades, and the publisher asked me to do the foreword. It is something which I was very happy to do. It was open press, but the same. Yes, that's right, open press, 2006. And for me, this is a reflection of how a very complex issue is handled in Islam. It is with tremendous depth and profundity that Islam handles this issue of a person leaving the faith and at the same time protecting one's right of conscience, the right of belief. I said a while ago that there were two dimensions. The second dimension in the Quran, which is really amazing about religion and the freedom of religion, is the way in which it accepts religious diversity in the Quran. It even says that this is the divine plan. that this diversity is the divine plan. Because Allah could have made us into one people if Allah wanted, but Allah chooses to make us different in terms of our beliefs, not just in relation to the color of our skin and our language and culture and so on and so forth. So there is tremendous variety, diversity. And Islam celebrates that, accepts that, which I think is very, very significant. And that you would find in chapter 5, verse 48, about Allah's divine plan, that Allah could have made us into one people if Allah had wanted. And it goes on further, the Quran, in chapter 49, verse 13, Surah Al-Hujurat, where it says that Allah had made us all different so that we would know one another, which is just amazing. Can you imagine the power of this verse in the midst of people who deliberately preach hatred? Because here is a verse that clearly says that the reason for all these differences, for this variety, is to enable us to know one another. And the most noble is not someone who belongs to a particular culture or community or even a particular faith. The noblest is the one who is most righteous in the eyes of Allah, the most righteous. The person who is capable of taqwa at the highest level is the noblest. So friends, the Quran is clearly on the side of inclusivity, openness, universalism. There is no doubt about it at all. That is the underlying message of the Quran. And of course, you have the Charter of Medina, lower in terms of status, but nonetheless important for us to hold on to. Now, what has been the conduct of Muslim societies right through the ages? I would like to argue that by and large, Muslim societies, whether it is Palestine, a few years after it embraced Islam, in large numbers after Umar ibn Khattab's march into Jerusalem in 638 AD, Andalusia, that is modern Spain, for centuries, the Abbasid Caliphate, most of the time, the Mughal Empire in India, parts of East Africa, West Africa, and of course Southeast Asia. There's been tremendous diversity. And Muslims have been able to live in harmony with people of different faiths. This is their track record, by and large. Which is why I think some of you would be aware of this, the great British historian, Arnold Toynbee. He told the West that if there's anything that the West can learn from Islam, it is its ability. It is its ability to conquer racial consciousness. To conquer racial consciousness. To establish this notion of a common humanity, because it is something in practice, it is proven. It is its track record. Of course, it's also true that it was not just the Quran or the example of the Prophet which influenced Muslim societies. These multi-ethnic, multi-religious Muslim societies, they were also influenced by their own situation. They were influenced by the writings of the great fuqaha, which were sometimes not as universal as the Quran. They were also influenced by certain specific episodes. For instance, we know that after the conquest of Baghdad in 1258 and other great cities in the Muslim world, Samarkand, Aleppo, Buhara, and cities of that sort, a certain inward-looking attitude developed among Muslims because of the conquest, because of the destruction. These things had happened, and certainly colonialism also had that sort of impact. So we know that things had evolved differently at some periods. But at the same time, don't forget that in Southeast Asia as in East Africa and parts of Central Africa, you had the tremendous influence of Sufism. Sufism, genuine Sufism, preaching universality and oneness, like in Southeast Asia. The Sufi influence was very strong when the religion spread rapidly in the early centuries. And that brings me to yet another sub-theme. All these influences, most positive, some negative, impacted upon the Malay world. When Islam came to the Malay world from the 12th century onwards, we know it spread in this part of the world. The first fully established Malay Muslim Sultanate was in Kedah in 1136. And that's the 12th century. And because the spread was peaceful, a very important point, the spread of Islam in the whole region was peaceful. There was not a single battle that took place related to religion, unlike, say, northern India, or unlike parts of West Asia, or even parts of Europe. But in the case of Southeast Asia, like certain other places too, it was very peaceful, the spread of Islam. And because it was peaceful, it was possible for this new religion and the adherents of the new religion, and they multiplied very, very fast, to live in peace and harmony with adherents of the older religions, Hindus and Buddhists. They continued to live, and they continued to be protected. They were regarded as dhimmis, in some instances, the protected people, by Muslim governments, and they continued to play their role. And this is also the reason why some of the newer people who settled in the Malay Peninsula and in the larger Malay world, they were also treated well. I'm referring to the small Chinese communities, there's clusters of them, in Kelantan, in Terengganu, in Malacca. So smooth was their integration to what were basically Malay polities, Malay societies, that they contributed, these newer communities, to the language, to the Malay language. The Malay language has the influence of these elements, to Malay cuisine, to Malay attire, from the Babas and Nyonyas, for instance. These were examples of that sort of fusion that took place. In other words, contrary to what some people tell us today, contrary to what some non-Muslims think about Islam, the essence of Islam and Muslim societies, right up to British colonial rule, these societies were very cosmopolitan. They were open, they were accommodative. Malacca, at the height of its power, it was a city where 80 languages were spoken. 80 languages. And this is recorded as a historical fact. And you had all these diverse communities who lived together and traded with one another and traded with the outside world. Friends, now this aspect of history, this background, changed with direct British colonial rule. And this is so important in understanding what is happening in Malaysia today. The whole question of citizenship, attitudes, and so on, you cannot understand these things without knowing this, without appreciating this force of history. It changed with British colonialism. Because when the British established their rule through different systems of governance, but basically it was their control over the Malay Peninsula, and of course Penang, Singapore, and so on, they opened the floodgates to the huge influx of Chinese and Indians who were there to serve the colonial economy. They were brought in to serve the colonial economy. An export-oriented colonial economy based upon tin and rubber. That was their purpose. Separate enclaves emerged. There was really no genuine interaction between these enclaves and the Malay heartland. That was the new reality. Divided communities, which is what has happened in many other colonial societies. You look at the rich history of colonialism in the Fijis, in the West Indies, in East Africa, in Sri Lanka, in every part of the world, this is what had happened. Communities emerged, separate enclaves, very little interaction. When they were forced, because of circumstances, to provide independence, to grant independence to Malaya, on the eve of independence, they insisted that the Chinese and Indians should be given citizenship. Why is this something that is important to understand? Because one of the reasons why the first massive Malay revolt against the British took place in 1946 against the Malayan Union was because the Malays rejected the British idea of citizenship, which would have de-recognized, it would have eliminated, annihilated Malay history. The Malays were against it, and rightly so. Anyone would be against that sort of thing. So what the British did was, just before independence, because of their own interests, they told the Malay elite, the sultans, and the leaders of UMNO, the leading Malay political party, that if you want independence, the precondition is granting citizenship to the Chinese and Indians. The Malay leaders wanted independence at all costs. They wanted independence at all costs, because it was something which a lot of them had fought for, part of the struggle. And so they said, okay. And what happened is something which is seldom highlighted in our political science books and in many of our books on law in this country. 1 million people became citizens overnight. It changed the landscape totally. It is something that has no precedence in history, where suddenly 1 million people, and mind you, at that time, the Malay population itself was about 5.5 million. 1 million becoming citizens overnight meant a total transformation of the political landscape. In terms of voting power, in the 1955 elections, federal elections before Merdeka, the non-Malay voting community was only 15%, 15%. Those who became citizens in 1948 under the Federation of Malaya Agreement, they qualified genuinely for citizenship. But by 1959, the first parliamentary elections after independence, 2 years after independence, the non-Malay voting percentage had become 40%, from 15% to 40%, which is a huge transformation. Again, as I said, something that has never happened in history. Which is why the alliance that won 51 out of the 52 seats in 1955, 2 years before Merdeka, 2 years after Merdeka, in the first federal elections, that alliance, they lost 2 Malay majority seats, Kelantan and Terengganu. They were defeated in both those states. And the main reason for that was the citizenship laws, the new citizenship laws that accommodated the non-Malays in such huge numbers. Understandable, which is why for PAS this was the major issue. For the first 12 years of independence, it was the whole question of land, identity, and citizenship. for PAS, the Islamic Party. They felt that everything had been changed as a result of what had happened. Friends, if you understand this, you will understand why special position was integrated into the Constitution. The whole concept of special position, not just Article 153 or a couple of other related articles dealing with the special position of the Malays, but the whole philosophy of special position. It was basically, as I argued way back in 1973, it was basically compensation, ganti rugi, for the Malays. That after they had lost control of their land, from a nation, a people who defined the land, who gave their name to the land, they became a community among communities. To compensate a people who had now become a community among communities, they were given special position. The sultanates, now constitutional monarchs, the Malay language as the language of the land, Islam as the religion of the federation, these are words from our constitution. This was compensation. And in very specific terms, Article 153, you know about specific areas of business licenses, scholarships at certain levels of tertiary education, places in the civil service, again, certain strata, and of course land. Land is not in 153 as such, but it is a very important provision in the Constitution. The Malays already had Malay reserves from the old days. In fact, the first Malay reserve created by the British was after the Malays had lost control totally over land in Kuala Lumpur. It was Kampung Baru, the first Malay reserve. You know, for many, many years, when I used to teach in University of Science Malaysia, I used to talk about this whole background to our history, so that people really understand what the situation is, what the challenge is. Because you find that many people don't refer to these things at all. In the name of human rights, in the name of inter-ethnic harmony and so on. But without understanding this, one will not be able to appreciate the challenges that confront us today. In fact, it is a wonder why, in spite of this, if you look at how difficult the situation had become, in spite of this, you find that the nation is held together. It is really a wonder, 60 years. And I've said this, that if you look at one of the most important criterion of harmony in any multi-ethnic society, it is the absence or lack of what is called ethnic violence. Malaysia, there's been minimal ethnic violence compared to so many other countries. Even if you look at Indonesia, you look at countries like Sri Lanka, any number of countries, a minimum of ethnic violence. It is held together in spite of everything. And I think there are at least 3 reasons. There may be many other reasons, but let me just mention 3 reasons why we have been able to hold together. And then, of course, the strains that confront us today, which are also very serious. The 3 reasons which would explain why we have held together, friends, I think are, number 1, the idea of sharing political power and administrative power, linked to citizenship, linked to what I would regard as the attitude of the Malay elite, that they were prepared to share. They were prepared to accommodate. As I mentioned earlier, citizenship itself was an act of accommodation. But again, politics, power, from 15% to 40%, you know, that sort of transformation in terms of political power. They were prepared to do that. And that explains stability, a certain degree of stability. And that stability enabled us to achieve a certain degree of economic progress. So that is a very important factor, the power sharing that people talk about very often. Now, the second factor linked to that is, of course, not just power sharing. I think in terms of the economy, we adopted an approach to the economy which also had a dimension that was very sensitive to the ethnic landscape, if you look at the economy. The leaders realized that if one tried to mess around too much with the market, it would affect not just the economy, it will affect the non-Malay position, the interests of the Chinese in particular. So they allowed the market to flourish. In other words, it was a market economy, capitalist, but at the same time, you had the state playing an active role, an interventionist role right from the beginning. I mean, Felda was right from 1956, actually. And then, of course, all the other institutions that were set up to help the Malays in particular, especially those who had been marginalized, because don't forget that Malay marginalization was something very serious. It was not just the political accommodation. Don't forget that in 1957, 64% of the Malays lived below the poverty line, which in a sense gives greater meaning to this notion of accommodation. 64% lived below the poverty line. So their economic position had to be improved, and the state played an active role in trying to improve the economic position of the Malays who had been disadvantaged, disenfranchised in the past. But that economy, where the market was kept and there was the state playing its role, flourished. On the average, from 1957 to today, 2017, Malaysia is one of the few countries that has been able to record an average of 6.5% to 7% growth rate. It's really quite remarkable, on an average, because there were some years when we were recording 10%, 11%, and so on. Now, of course, it's less, like many other countries in the world. Growth rate, but at the same time, redistribution. Redistribution. Health service, education. I'm always very happy and proud to tell people that the WHO, more than, I think, 25 years ago, recognized Malaysia's healthcare program as one of the best in the third world. And it has maintained that record in terms of its healthcare program. And of course, in terms of education, literacy rate, you may not believe it when you talk to some of our young people these days, but still, the official records literacy rate is about 95%. It's 95%. People who can read and write and so on. That's the record. Literacy, not education. So this is the positive dimension. So the second dimension. And the third dimension, I think, is sociocultural. I think by and large, Malaysians are a people who are tolerant, they're accommodative. Here we're talking about the people. This is not the state or political parties and so on. I'm just talking about people. I think we're very accommodative. The Malays and the indigenous peoples of Sabah and Sarawak, if you look at their cultures, there's a great deal of accommodation. Iban culture is very accommodative, so is Kadazan culture, and certainly Malay culture. Very accommodative in trying to accept, trying to understand, reach out to the other. And I think the Chinese and Indians in this country, after generations, they have also developed a sort of live and let live attitude, give and take. They understand that, which is, I think, one of the reasons why our socio-cultural landscape supports this attitude and has helped this country. Having said that, friends, let me add that there are strains, and the strains are pronounced, and we must be aware of them. But the strains are related to some very fundamental challenges that confront the whole notion of citizenship. It goes back to the central theme of our discussion this evening, citizenship. for a lot of non-Malays, except I think a handful who understand the history, the background, the evolution of this country. For a lot of non-Malays, the present situation and the situation that has existed for a number of decades now is very unfair. They feel that it's not right, that their special position, that the Malays are recognized as people who should be given preferential treatment, their quotas and so on. They're not happy with it. And that unhappiness has permeated Malaysian politics for decades. For decades, that unhappiness has been there. I've looked in one of my articles at all the major issues since the 50s. Every one of these issues is linked to this sentiment. Citizenship as an issue in the 50s, language, and after language, the question of the economy, NEP and so on, and then after that, religion. It's all linked willy-nilly to this whole question of how people feel. And in the case of a lot of non-Malays, a lot of unhappiness about what they see as an unfair situation. And they feel that even if in 1957, 64% were below the poverty line, today the situation is different. There is a thriving Malay middle class. There is a robust Malay dimension in the upper echelons of society. Why are there these quotas and preferential treatments? And it's not just a lot of non-Malays. There are some Malays who also feel that this is not right. That's the situation, the reality that confronts us. And there is, of course, abuse of special position, which is a fact. That what is meant for the poor and the disadvantaged, because that was the thinking behind Article 153, while it had strong historical grounds, but nonetheless, the feeling was that the socio-economic dimension was important. There was an element of justice that one should not forget. But some people seem to have forgotten that. And special position is used to advance the interests of well-heeled Malays and Dayaks and Kadazans and so on. So that has also created quite a bit of unhappiness. And you find that a situation has developed where some people see this as natural rights, rights pertaining to a community, a people, because of its position. In other words, rights qua rights because of who they are. And this is a challenge in dealing with the question of citizenship. This is on the side of many non-Malays and how they feel, perceptions of this sort. On the side of many Malays, there are also perceptions that are related to some of these sentiments. A lot of Malays, for a very, very long while, have always felt that the non-Malays have never appreciated their sacrifice. The fact that what was essentially a Malay land, a Malay nationalism, a Malay state system, it just couldn't achieve its natural fruition. And it's a fact. It is a truncated Malay nationalism that confronts us today. It never really achieved its fruition. Why? Because of what happened after the Second World War, the accommodation, as I talked a while ago, of the non-Malays and so on. So the Malays feel that somehow the non-Malays have never appreciated this. And they continue to resent the Malays. This is the sentiment amongst a lot of Malays. And there are also a lot of Malays who feel that the Malay situation, even if there's abuse and all the rest of it, that a lot of Malays still will not be able to compete with the non-Malays in an open economy, partly because of socio-economic differences, socio-cultural differences. They may not be able to compete, and it's not fair to demand that certain aspects of special position, which in any case is restricted to certain areas, that they should be dismantled, that it is not fair. So there is this sort of sentiment on the Malay side. And I think to make it worse, today there are a lot of Malays who are reacting, and this has not got onto the radar screen yet, but it is there and it is developing. And believe me, as a student of society, when I look at little eruptions here and there, I know that these eruptions are actually very dangerous. They reflect something far more fundamental, which is happening in our society. What do I mean by this? There are a lot of Malays who feel that 2008, the leading Malay party lost its 2/3 in parliament. 2013, it continued to lose to hemorrhage. And they know, a lot of people know, that the vast majority of Chinese are not with the ruling elite. And on top of it now, they feel that a lot of Chinese have become, to put it in very rough terms, if you may pardon me, that they have become arrogant. And the arrogance is partly because of the rise of China. This is the feeling, this is the sentiment. The rise of China, a lot of Chinese here feel that, look at how dependent Malaysia is on the Chinese. Businesses, investments, and all the rest of it. And the Chinese are in control. There's resentment that is developing along these lines. These are real. Even if one would be able to argue against some of these things in terms of economics and the nuts and bolts of the social structure and so on, but the sentiments are real, and you have to deal with them, sentiments of this sort. So on both sides, you have growing, spreading negative sentiments, which is not good for the country. It's not good for the country. Which is why I look at the Surau incident in Johor and the incident in the Prime Minister's official residence the other night, when someone thought that the solution was a very unartistic solution, just to slap or try to slap someone. These are things that are happening in the country. And this brings me to the conclusion, friends. What do you do in a situation like this? I think it is so important, and we don't do it in Malaysia at all. Not the politicians, not the academics, not the activists, none of them, we don't do this. I think we have to take the bull by its horns. What do I mean by this? We must address these challenges. When we talk about ethnic relations, do we talk about things like this? Instead, we sweep everything under the carpet and we start talking about all the nice and lovely things and, how we can all have another durian party and we'll all be happy and all the rest of it. It's not the solution. We have to deal with this. I think one has to explain to the non-Malays some of the realities in this society. We have to explain to the Malays what these realities are, both sides. And this is what we have been trying to do in our own small way in Ihsan One Malaysia. You look at our citizenship program, the things we've been writing, you just go to our website. We have been as candid as possible about these issues, but in a very courteous and diplomatic way, without hurting anyone, or without creating the sort of situation that will lead to further deterioration in ethnic relations. But I think you have to deal with these issues, you have to explain, you have to communicate. We are not good at communicating, we're not good at explaining these things. We feel embarrassed sometimes, at least certain segments of certain communities. In other instances, you find that somehow one feels, well, I'm right, I'm always right. And there is an attitude amongst Malaysians, which I find very, very disturbing. They all talk about justice, but it is a very biased notion of the justice. A lot of Malays, when they talk about justice, it will be just from one side. And the same thing with a lot of non-Malays. They talk about justice, but it's just perceived from one particular angle. They can't see both sides of the equation. And this, I think, is a terrible shortcoming. We have to overcome that. Communication, education, awareness building. Even if it means sweeping out the dirt from under the carpet and facing realities, we have to do that. Number two, I think we have to draw upon the rich resources that are available to us from our own philosophies, which again we have not done, to strengthen the notion of common citizenship, of understanding the other, of empathy. There are huge resources. In Islam, we're very much aware of it, those resources, and we refer to some of those things. From the Quran, from the Sunnah, from Muslim history, we have to draw upon these. But instead, we talk about things that are negative rather than what is positive. Look at Chinese philosophy. There are huge resources about caring for the other. In my abstract, I've got this quote from Confucius, who says that the person who wants to succeed should make sure that others succeed. If you want to establish yourself, you have to make sure that others establish themselves. That's very strong. You know, there is a quote from Taoism attributed to Lao Tzu. We cannot be certain because there are no hard, firm records on this, but something attributed to Lao Tzu, where he says that the real mark of a human being is his ability to put his heart where the other person's heart is. That's empathy, the highest expression of empathy. I think we have to draw upon these resources and try to make our people aware that this is what the situation is. And lastly, I think we have to act in a just manner. We have to act in a just manner. The secret of success in any multi-ethnic society, or any society for that matter, but especially in a multi-ethnic society, is delivering justice, so that everyone feels that justice has been delivered. And even those who have this biased notion of justice, they would say, those who have authority, those who have influence, those who have wealth, they are fair. They're fair to everyone. Now that sort of notion of justice must develop in our society. Ensure justice, deliver justice. To be very specific about this, I think there is no need, friends, after all these years, there is really no need for us to link the pursuit of justice to ethnicity. We have to separate the two. Let me be even more direct. We must have the courage to base entry into universities, promotions, wherever, public sector, private sector, it should be based upon merit, on excellence, on ability. And when it comes to helping the poor, it must be based upon need, upon one's real situation. It's not difficult. It can be done. It can be done. Many years ago, and I want to end on this note, in the university that I was associated with for many years, the first vice chancellor, he sought to recruit students into the off-campus program. The university had the first off-campus program in the country. At a time, this was in 1970-71, when ethnic quotas were the order of the day. His recruitment of students into the off-campus program was based entirely upon principles of need. In other words, those who came from certain backgrounds, certain geographical areas, they were given priority. And believe me, the amazing thing was, what he got at the end was a very multi-ethnic student population in the off-campus program. It was very multi-ethnic, and it seemed just, and people felt that it was just. It can be done. It is not something that is impossible. And if we are prepared to do that, and at the same time, as I said, draw upon our rich resources and deal with issues which have clouded our imagination, which have clouded our perception. If we are prepared to do that, then I think there is a future. We'll be able to develop a notion of citizenship which is meaningful. A notion of citizenship that is guided by the two greatest principles which are eulogized in Islam, which Islam regards as the supreme principles. One, the principle of justice. The Quran tells us openly that that was the purpose of every prophet, to uphold justice. That's very important. We develop a notion of citizenship inspired, informed by justice, and at the same time, another very important principle in the Quran, which again is something you'll find in other religions, the principle of compassion. justice and compassion. Every chapter in the Quran except one, it begins with the declaration, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. The notion of compassion is very, very important. If we are guided by that, then inshallah, I think we have a beautiful future ahead. Thank you.